They say geniuses are born, not made. But sometimes, they are forged in the fires of pure, unfiltered arrogance. Picture Wembley Stadium. April 15, 1967. The air is thick with English smugness. England aren't just any team, they are the reigning, undisputed kings of the planet, holding the 1966 World Cup aloft. Their media has already written Scotland off as a minor speed bump on the road to eternal glory. The establishment expects a coronation. Instead, they get a mugging. In the middle of that hallowed turf, a man with socks rolled down to his ankles, a smirk plastered across his face, decides he doesn't just want to win. He wants to toy with them. He picks up the ball. He flips it into the air. He starts juggling it. On the pitch. During an international match against the world champions. Just gone. Bye-bye, English dignity. That man was Jim Baxter. Slim Jim. A player whose name triggers hushed tones of reverence and heartbreak across Glasgow, London, and beyond. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's look at the witnesses. Because when the greatest players in the history of the sport step forward to talk about Baxter, they don't use normal language. They talk about a myth. Let's start with George Best. Yes, that George Best. The Northern Irish maestro who could bend reality with a football at his feet. When asked to compile his ultimate, Dream Team 11, a side featuring the absolute titans of world football, Best didn't hesitate. In central midfield, controlling the engine room of his fantasy 11, he slotted in Jim Baxter. Think about that for a second. George Best, a man who walked on water, a global icon of unadulterated genius, looked at the landscape of football history and decided that Slim Jim was the man he wanted pulling the strings. Best wasn't easily impressed. He lived in the fast lane, played without fear, and didn't hand out compliments to ordinary mortals. Yet, when it came to Baxter, Best recognized a kindred spirit. A player who played the game like it was jazz, improvising notes that nobody else could even hear. Now, let's cross the fierce, unyielding tribal divide of Scottish football. Glasgow. Where Celtic and Rangers fans would ordinarily rather share a coffin than a kind word about each other's players. Yet, what happens when you ask Celtic legends about Baxter? The hostility evaporates. Jimmy John Stone, Wee Jinky, arguably the greatest Celtic player who ever lived, a wizard who could weave through defenders in a telephone box, spoke of Baxter with absolute awe. Billy McNeil, the fierce captain who lifted the European Cup for Celtic, didn't grit his teeth when Baxter's name came up. They conceded his brilliance. They had to. Because when you watched Baxter orchestrate a match, the old firm rivalry felt small. You weren't watching a Ranger, you were watching football's equivalent of a grandmaster playing against amateurs. Let me be fair for a second. Football tribalism is normally a blood sport. Fans will deny the sun is shining if a rival player says it is. But Baxter crossed that invisible line. He was so transcendentally good that even the men whose job it was to hate him couldn't help but stop and admire the show. So how did a kid from Fife become the undisputed king of British football before his career imploded under the weight of his own lifestyle? To understand Baxter, you have to look past the myths and follow the evidence. And the evidence starts long before that sunny afternoon at Wembley. Let's rewind the tape to 1963. For years before the Wembley humiliation, Scotland travelled to and faced the might of England once again. This wasn't a friendly, it was a battlefield. Early in the match, Scotland was reduced to 10 men. In the brutal, unforgiving reality of 1960s football, losing a man meant you batten down the hatches, park the bus, and pray for a lucky draw. Tell that to Jim Baxter. Instead of folding, Baxter took absolute, dictatorial control of the fixture. He didn't just adapt to being a man down, he made England look like they were the ones playing short-handed. He strutted across the pitch, dictating the tempo, mocking English defenders with body swerves that belonged in a ballet, and scoring 2 goals in a 2-1 victory that left the English press searching for words they hadn't invented yet. That wasn't a fluke. That was a statement of intent. Word traveled fast across the continent. When FIFA or international organizers needed a sprinkling of genuine stardust for exhibition and all-star matches, who did they call? They didn't just call local stars, they called the elite. Baxter found himself lining up in a world all-star selection alongside names that sound like ancient football gods: Ferenc Puskás, Alfredo Di Stefano, Eusebio, and Lev Yashin. Let that sink in. Slim Jim sharing a dressing room and a pitch with the undisputed royalty of the global game, and not looking out of place for a single second. He belonged in that company. His footballing IQ was stratospheric. While other players ran themselves into the ground, Baxter believed the ball should do the running. He walked when he had to, jogged when it suited him, and then, with one flick of his left boot, split a defense wide open before they even realized he was paying attention. Sir Alex Ferguson, long before he became the legendary, hairdryer-wielding boss of Manchester United, watched Baxter up close. Ferguson wasn't prone to hyperbole. He was a pragmatist, a man who valued hard work, discipline, and grit above all else. But when Ferguson spoke about Jim Baxter, his voice changed. Ferguson famously described Baxter's play style as being set to music. Think about the poetry in that description. Football, in the industrial, bruising era of British sport, was often viewed as a trade, a blue-collar job fought out in the mud and rain. Baxter turned it into a symphony. He was the conductor, and everyone else on the pitch was just playing instruments in his orchestra. If Ferguson, the ultimate taskmaster, saw art in Baxter, it tells you everything you need to know about the sheer, unadulterated aesthetic perfection of his talent. Willie Henderson, his legendary Rangers teammate, watched it day in and day out. Henderson knew the secrets. He knew that Baxter didn't just beat opponents, he demoralized them. Baxter would often tell his teammates before a game exactly how he was going to dismantle the opposition, and then he'd walk out onto the pitch and execute it with terrifying precision. Yet, for all the praise from Best, Ferguson, John Stone, and Henderson, there is a dark, tragic undercurrent to the Jim Baxter story. Because a genius like that doesn't just fade away quietly. What happens when a man has too much talent, too much money, and zero internal brakes? Let's talk about the ugly side of the myth. Because you cannot tell the story of Jim Baxter without confronting the self-destruction. By the mid-1960s, Baxter wasn't just a football player, he was a pop culture phenomenon in Scotland. He drove fast cars, lived large in Glasgow's glamorous nightlife scene, and treated authority figures, whether club managers, board members, or football association suits, with a level of casual contempt that would make modern superstars look like choirboys. To the establishment, Baxter was a nightmare. He didn't respect their rules, he didn't care about their curfews, and he certainly didn't feel intimidated by their suits. He played by his own code. But the piper always demands payment. In 1964, playing for Rangers against Rapid Vienna in Europe, the bill came due. A bad tackle shattered his leg. For most players, that's a career-ending catastrophe. For Baxter, it was a severe dent in the Ferrari. He came back, miraculously, driven by sheer muscle memory and natural brilliance, but he was never quite the same physical animal. He adapted by relying even more on his brain, slowing the game down in his head to a crawl while everyone else sprinted past him. That intellectual dominance led him straight to Wembley in 1967. Denis Law, his great Scotland teammate, was sitting injured in the stands that day, watching in agony as Scotland beat England 3-2. But even Law, who missed out on the glory of playing in that specific fixture, had a hilarious, telling reaction to Baxter's legendary keepy-uppies. Law wasn't just amused, he was frustrated. Why? Because in Law's eyes, England were there for the taking. They were broken, demoralized, and completely exposed. Law felt that instead of juggling the ball to wind up the crowd and humiliate the opposition, Baxter should have sliced them open and scored 3 or 4 more goals to utterly destroy them. Think about how absurd that standard is. A player humiliates the world champions on their own turf, plays keep up in the middle of the pitch, and his own teammate is mad at him for not scoring enough. That's how terrifyingly good Jim Baxter was. Excellence wasn't enough, total annihilation was expected. But the flashier the candle, the faster it burns. After leaving Rangers, Baxter's career took a downward trajectory through Sunderland and Nottingham Forest. The lifestyle caught up with the legs. The alcohol, the late nights, the endless adoration from fans who wanted to buy him a drink at every pub from Glasgow to the English border, it took its toll. He retired at just 31 years old. Just gone. Bye-bye, peak years. The transition from football royalty to ordinary life wasn't kind. The same establishment that he had mocked on the pitch watched his struggles with a mixture of quiet judgment and institutional indifference. Baxter fought a very public, heartbreaking battle with alcoholism, losing much of the fortune he had accumulated during his playing days. Yet, even in his darkest days, when his health was failing and the glamour had long since evaporated, the aura never left him. When people talked about Jim Baxter, they didn't talk about his mistakes, they talked about Wembley. They talked about the way he moved. They talked about the music. Baxter himself was brutally honest about his demons and his choices. He never played the victim. He knew he had been blessed with gifts that most people couldn't even dream of possessing, and he knew he had burned through them like a wildfire. He lived life entirely on his own terms, refusing to bow to anyone, not FIFA, not club chairmen, not football critics. When he passed away in 2001 at the age of 61, the tributes didn't come from dusty old record books. They came from the soul of the game. Fans who had seen him play spoke of him with tears in their eyes, not because he won a mountain of medals, but because he made them feel alive. He was football's ultimate rebel, a genius who proved that you could conquer the establishment, laugh in their faces, and walk away on your own script. Football at this scale is never just a game. It's a moment in time. And Jim Baxter was the soundtrack to the greatest era Scotland ever knew. What's your verdict on Slim Jim? Does natural genius excuse a life lived on the edge, or is unfulfilled potential the ultimate tragedy? Drop your take in the comments below. I read every single one. A like genuinely helps more than you'd think, pushing stories like this out to more people. And subscribe if you want more deep dives into the legends and the controversies they left behind. I'll see you in the next one.